Hey there folks, welcome to Spectrum Pulse. He's about music, movies, art, and culture. And today, we're going to be talking about the sophomore album from Avicii, titled Stories. You know, of all the electronic producers that I've ever covered in the mainstream, both in full-length reviews and on Billboard Breakdown, Avicii is one. He just continues to frustrate me, and I'm not a fan of that. See, those of you who follow me for a long time now know that I wasn't exactly too kind to his debut album, True. Not a bad record, but ultimately an experiment that lended steadily decreasing dividends throughout its entire runtime in attempting to fuse folk music with accessible EDM. And yet, many of you also probably know that two Avicii songs have landed on my year-end list for my favorite hit songs of 2013 and 2014, with Wake Me Up and Hey Brother respectively. And the stranger thing is, I'll stand behind both of those choices, even though I'd argue that True was only ever a decent album. And here's the crux to that argument. Avicii is the sort of artist who's got a great grasp on the fundamentals of composition and the broad strokes of his experimentation, but can get kind of stuck on the details, which is why the folk sections of that debut album ended up working far better than any of the electronic segments. Sure, he's a strong melodic composer and putting together dynamic, surging progressions and marrying them with some well-textured guitars and banjos and solid acoustic grooves, but the second he tried adding in thicker beats and more synthetic production, things kind of went off the rails. Hell, he's not even a bad lyricist in a pop sort of vein, all of which makes me think that Avicii might be a better songwriter than producer and performer at this point, but I can't help but see the irony in an electronic producer who blended in folk and made it work, except in the underlying electronic production itself. But that was 2013. And let's face it, the EDM world has changed significantly in even just the past 2 years. The leftovers of the folk boom that Avicii was riding are long dead now, and most modern EDM has gone to the deep house, or the R&B neo-soul route, that'd be like your Calvin Harris, or I've suffered badly for it, like say Zedd. Where does Avicii fall with his sophomore release Stories? Well, that's a tricky question. Mostly because Avicii's album goes in about 6 different directions, sometimes within the same song, which leads Story to be the sort of album that varies wildly in tone, instrumentation, and execution, which can lead to several to brand this album as being very colorful and varied, and for others to call it a complete and utter mess. For me, well, the more I've listened through it, the more I'm inclined to lean to the latter category. But I'm not exactly complaining, because this is the sort of record so overstuffed with ideas that it's kind of hard to look away. It's kind of enjoyable despite that. The problem comes in a lot of the execution of all those ideas, and that's where I'd argue that just like on True, Avicii kind of falls short here, except with folktronica underscoring the entire album. It's even more scattershot than usual. So okay, how to describe this? Well, probably the best place to start, as with most electronic albums, would be in the lyrics, because they tend to be pretty thin, and Stories is no exception here. Quite simply, Avicii tends to stick in his broad, borderline cliche generalities for his anthems, with this record gaining most of its lyrical momentum on that rush of anticipation about love coming eventually, with the story sketching out how exactly that might happen. Now, some fall exactly where you might think they would on the dance floor hookup jams of Touch Me and City Lights, but credit to me on the latter song for at least emphasizing how thin and insubstantial such a connection could be, only emphasized further by the usage of vocoders to distance from the human experience. More in this album is coasting by an anticipation that love will pay off in the end, like the lead-off single Waiting for Love, or 10 More Days, or the heartfelt reunion of Broken Arrows. But that's not saying that it can't misfire, like on the awfully presumptuous mood of True Believer, that seems to assume that if you wish hard enough, love will end up coming up between the two of you. Yeah, okay, sometimes it doesn't always work like that. The other person does need to consent, you know. But really, the larger focus on this album is in the journey and that grind towards his dreams, which outside the hometown anthem somewhere in Stockholm, he seems committed to let those dreams fall to pieces if he can manage to find love in the end. The problem comes in that journey doesn't really manifest as distinctly unique as you might think. It's hard not to listen to the reggae of Can't Catch Me or the California anthem of Sunset Jesus and find them all just a little bit cliched or overplayed and a little bit overdone. Now granted, cliche can be just fun if you execute it properly, and Avicii did find a slew of solid singers to back him up here. Simon Alger brings in the potent, soulful vocals that Aloe Black brought on True, albeit not quite as good, and Wayne Hector's short but memorably rough presence on Trouble definitely works for me, despite that song being shorter than it really should have been. It could have had another minute there. Hell, Alex Ebert and Edward Sharpe and the Magnetic Zeros does surprisingly well in the cleaner production against the strident pianos of For a Better Day. And then there's Zach Brown of all people on Broken Arrows, who just sounds fantastic as Avicii gives his vocals plenty of room to really breathe and rely on that core of charisma that's always given him a ton of presence behind the microphone. And then there's Matt adds Yahoo and Wyclef Jean with a reggae of Can't Catch Me, and look, it sounds exactly how you think it would sound. And despite the cliche of that song, they do fine enough with it. It's a decent song. Where this album really stumbles when the vocal guests can't quite hold off. Christopher Fogelmert is absolutely huge on the hook of Pure Grindin', but Earl St. Clair's bluesy snarl clashes kind of awkwardly with the synth there, and it highlights all the more how the song resembles David Guetta's Hey Mama with better lyrics to be sure, but far weaker production and progressions. That's before you get Gavin DeGraw sounding completely anonymous and stilted behind the mix of Sunset Jesus, or Chris Martin of Coldplay batting cleanup on True Believer behind what sounds like Avicii himself in front of the microphone. And maybe it's just the clumsy vocal production trying to smooth over some of his nasal, more heavily accented tones, but Avicii really doesn't sound that good in front of the mic. His strength is in composition, not in delivery in front of the stage. And you know what? That's the thing. This guy can write fantastic melody lines that really stick in your mind and give his hooks an easy leg up for me, typically anchoring them in his pianos or the synth lines that will inevitably ebb in and out a little bit, but ultimately do drive a lot of great momentum. He's got good crescendos. And like on True, he's got a knack for blending in acoustic instrumentation that ends up working pretty well. The reggae turn on Can't Catch Me might have come out of absolutely nowhere, but it's better handled than you might think. It doesn't sound that bad, but you can tell that Avicii wanted to replicate that huge swell of his best material. Why else would he pepper so many songs with crowd cheers and too much breezy cymbals? It's honestly a little bit overstuffed there, and yet he feels hamstrung by an EDM scene that has unfortunately evolved past it in the mainstream. And so Avicii ends up stabbing at whatever could possibly work here, and he really lands a lot of mixed results. For the most part, I like the plucked strings and the xylophones and the more diverse percussion that Avicii tries to bring in to add more flavor, but it doesn't excuse how often that beat is pushed a lot higher in the mix to jut right through his melodies and disrupt them, or the fact that so many of the crescendos and textures in the sound feel oddly muffled and prevented from really exploding. Sure, Broken Arrows might feel frenetic on its breakdown, and not nearly as strong as Zac Brown's own Tomorrow Never Comes, which came out earlier this year and is awesome, but at least hits that point, at least has that crescendo. When you look at songs like Somewhere in Stockholm or Waiting for Love or the painfully weak album closer Gonna Love Ya, probably the weakest song on the album, I found myself waiting for an explosion that never really materialized. And that's before the retro disco and stabs at funk on Talk to Myself and Touch Me that might draw initial comparisons to Daft Punk until you realize that Daft Punk actually had restraint and a sense of groove on this album that it's too jittery to really manifest. The closest of the album's standout, City of Lights, is probably my favorite song, but even it feels stiffer than it really should, and that skittering beat on the intro and outro does feel a little bit overlong. And that's where we get tracks that try to blend in all the influences together and end up a complete mess, like the Folktronica stab on 10 More Days that then tries to inject some funk-inspired guitar warbles, and it doesn't fit at all. Or the Rollick of Sunset Jesus that again feels disrupted by that very brittle synth line and that overlarge beat. Or maybe Somewhere in Stockholm, which might have actually worked if the strings and the snare drum actually had some brightness and texture and some thickness and actually had some pomp and presence to them to go for more of that anthemic vibe instead of sounding just completely washed out and just kind of inert to me. Ugh. This is really frustrating because I really do like Avicii. I admire his melodies, and the guy clearly has a ton of imagination and an abundance of ideas. He's the right kind of guy to be making this sort of music, but this is an awkward as hell album, only redeemed by a few great guest performers and some solid compositions. And what's all the more frustrating is I can't really blame Avicii for all of this, because you can tell he's straining to cut loose and make a more big, explosive album, and yet ends up in trying to cater to current taste. He ends up hemming himself in and not possessing the same knack for groove or production as he does elsewhere in his productions. As a whole, I really want to endorse this album despite its flaws, so I'm giving it a very, very light 6 out of 10, but I definitely urge you all to check this out anyway, as it's a case of good intentions marred by some of the execution. But I will give Avicii credit. I'm always going to cover this guy's album in comparisons with some others, because at least in comparison to his competition, he'll at least be interesting. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. Anything else I may be able to do to improve my presentation, or any other albums coming out that you want me to take a look at, I'd be more than happy to give them a listen. Just give me some time. I've got a really busy schedule right now. I'm trying to work through everything. October's going to be insane for me. But until then, I'm Mark, you're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.